one. The camera that wasn't in the listing 2:14 a.m. I heard the soft click of a door closing somewhere upstairs. The problem was I was the only person staying in the house, and the only door I had opened since arriving was the front one. For a few seconds, I stayed still on the couch, listening. The house settled back into silence the way quiet suburban houses do late at night. Faint refrigerator hum, air vents breathing slowly, nothing else moving. But I knew the sound I'd heard, a door closing, not loudly, just enough to catch the latch. I checked my phone again, no new messages. I had sent 2 to the host earlier that evening. The first was around 11:40 p.m. when I arrived and noticed the keypad lock had already been unlocked. The second was 20 minutes later when I realized 2 of the interior doors in the hallway wouldn't open. Both messages still showed the same status. Delivered. No response. I had booked the place 3 days earlier while driving through Ohio. It was a quiet residential neighborhood outside Columbus. Rows of nearly identical houses, trimmed lawns, streetlights every half block. The listing photos looked normal. 3 bedrooms, clean kitchen, neutral furniture. Nothing unusual. The host profile had dozens of reviews, mostly short ones. Great stay, easy check-in, quiet neighborhood, the kind people leave when nothing interesting happens. When I arrived, the street was empty. No cars in the driveway, no lights inside. I parked at the curb, grabbed my bag, and walked up to the porch, expecting to punch in the code from the listing. But when I touched the keypad, the door swung open immediately, unlocked. At the time, I figured the previous guest had just left. Inside, the house smelled faintly warm, like someone had been running the heater earlier in the evening. The living room lights came on automatically when I stepped in. Motion sensors, maybe. I did a quick walkthrough the way I always do in short-term rentals. Kitchen, living room, bathroom, everything looked clean. No signs anyone had been there recently. Then I reached the hallway. 3 doors. One opened into a bedroom that matched the photos. That's where I left my bag. The second door opened into a linen closet. The third didn't move when I turned the knob. Locked. I tried the next door down the hall. Also locked. It wasn't unusual for hosts to keep certain rooms closed, but usually they mentioned it in the listing. This one hadn't. That was when I sent the first message. Hey, quick question. 2 interior doors seem locked. Just checking if that's normal. No response. Around midnight, I sat on the couch with my laptop, finishing a few emails. That was the first time I noticed the red light. It was small, about the size of a pinhead, high in the corner of the living room ceiling. For a moment, I thought it was a smoke detector indicator, but smoke detectors usually blink slowly. This one stayed steady. I stood up and stepped closer. As soon as I moved underneath it, the light went dark. I stared at the ceiling for a few seconds before sitting back down. When I looked up again a minute later, the red light was back. By 1 a.m., I had noticed 2 more. One near the bookshelf, one in the kitchen pointed toward the table. Both small, both steady, both disappearing when I stood directly beneath them. I opened the Airbnb listing again to double-check the amenities. Nothing about security cameras inside the house. Most listings mention exterior cameras for the driveway or front porch. Indoor cameras are usually against the rules unless clearly disclosed. I scrolled through the photos slowly. Living room, kitchen, bedroom, bathroom. No visible cameras, no red lights. At 1:28 a.m., I walked down the hallway again. The 2 locked doors were still closed. I pressed my ear against the first one. Nothing. Against the second. Also nothing. The house felt empty. Still. The kind of quiet where even small sounds carry easily. That's why the click at 2:14 a.m. was impossible to ignore. I stood up from the couch and walked halfway down the hallway. "Hello?" I said, not loudly. No response. The temperature in the house had dropped slightly since midnight. I could feel the cool air against my arms. I waited. Nothing moved. Eventually, I checked the bedroom upstairs. Empty. Bathroom upstairs. Empty. Every room I had access to looked exactly the same as when I arrived. Except for one thing. There was a red light in the hallway now. I hadn't noticed that one earlier. It sat just above the staircase railing, facing directly toward the living room. Back downstairs, I opened the Airbnb app again to message the host. The chat thread loaded slowly. For a moment, I thought the app had frozen. Then the host's name disappeared. The conversation header now showed only the property address. I refreshed the page. The profile picture was gone. The reviews were gone. The listing photos were still there, but the host account itself looked empty, like a placeholder. I refreshed again. Same result. My messages were still visible, but the account I had sent them to no longer had a profile attached to it. That was when I started looking carefully at the house. Not casually, carefully. I noticed the smoke detector in the living room was angled slightly downward. The bookshelf had a small hole drilled through the side panel facing the couch. The kitchen cabinet above the sink had a gap between the hinges wide enough to hide something small. Red lights, tiny openings, angles pointing toward places someone might sit. At 2:36 a.m., I walked slowly back down the hallway toward the locked doors. The red light above the staircase turned off as I passed underneath. Halfway down the hall, I stopped because I could hear something faint. Very faint. Not footsteps, not movement, just a soft mechanical hum coming from behind the first locked door. I leaned closer. It wasn't loud enough to be an appliance, more like electronics. Cooling fans. The kind computers make when they've been running for a long time. I stood there for maybe 30 seconds before noticing something else. The door wasn't completely flush with the frame. It was closed but not tight. There was a thin gap near the latch, just enough to see darkness inside, and just enough to see a small red light glowing somewhere in the room. Steady. Watching the hallway. That's when the humming inside the room stopped. The light stayed on, and from the other side of the door, very quietly, someone tried the handle. If you're still listening, you probably enjoy this kind of quiet horror. Subscribe for more stories like this. Story 2. The guest who was already there, 1:06 a.m. A slow, steady creak came from the floor above me. One board bending under weight, then another, as if someone was walking carefully across the upstairs hallway. I set my phone down on the kitchen counter and listened. The problem was the Airbnb listing had clearly said the cabin was a single-floor property. No upstairs, no loft, nothing above the ceiling. And yet the footsteps continued, moving from one end of the house to the other. I had arrived just before midnight. The cabin sat about 20 minutes off the nearest highway, at the end of a gravel road that cut through thick pine forest. No nearby houses, no street lights, just trees and the occasional wooden fence marking property lines. When I parked outside, the entire place was dark. The host had sent the entry code earlier that afternoon, along with a short message. Cabin is ready for you. No one else around for miles. Enjoy the quiet. At the time, that sounded like exactly what I wanted. After a long week of driving between job sites, quiet felt like a luxury. Inside, the cabin looked exactly like the listing photos. Small kitchen, a couch facing a wood stove, one bedroom down the hall, bathroom beside it. Everything neat, clean, recently vacuumed. I dropped my bag by the couch and opened the fridge to see what supplies the host had left. That was when I noticed the yogurt, half eaten. The lid was sitting beside it on the shelf. At first, I assumed it belonged to the host or cleaning crew. Maybe they had stopped by earlier in the day, but the spoon inside the container was still wet. I stared at it for a moment, trying to decide if that was strange enough to worry about. Probably not. People forget things. Cleaners rush. Someone might have been here earlier and left in a hurry. Still, I took a photo of the fridge just in case and sent the host a message through the app. Hey, quick question. There's some food already in the fridge. Just checking if that's normal. The message showed as delivered. No reply. The second thing I noticed was the toothbrush. It was sitting upright in the bathroom cup beside the sink. Blue handle, damp bristles. I hadn't even unpacked my bag yet. I touched the brush lightly with my finger. Still wet. That was when the cabin stopped feeling like a rental and started feeling like someone had stepped out of the room a few minutes before I walked in. I sent another message to the host. Also, there's a toothbrush in the bathroom that isn't mine. Still no response. Around 12:40 a.m., I started hearing faint sounds inside the cabin. Nothing dramatic, just small things. A shift of wood somewhere in the walls, the slow pop of the stove cooling down, the occasional rustle outside from wind moving through the trees. Cabins in the woods make noise. That part wasn't unusual, but the footsteps at 1:06 a.m. were, because they were clearly inside the house, above me, measured, slow, crossing the same section of floor twice. I walked into the hallway and looked up. The ceiling was solid pine boards with exposed beams. No stairs, no attic hatch, no loft. The listing photos had shown every room clearly. There was nowhere above me someone could walk. The footsteps stopped. For a few seconds, the cabin was completely silent again. Then I heard them moving in the opposite direction. I grabbed my phone and opened the Airbnb app again. Still no response from the host. I typed another message. I'm hearing footsteps above the cabin. Is there another unit connected to this place? The message sent. 3 dots appeared for a moment as if someone was typing. Then they vanished. No reply. At 1:24 a.m., the kitchen light turned on. I was sitting on the couch when it happened. The switch was on the far wall, across the room. No one was standing near it. The bulb hummed softly as it warmed up. I got up and walked into the kitchen slowly, checking every corner. Nothing. The door was still locked. Windows closed. The forest outside completely dark. That was when I heard a different sound. Not upstairs this time, inside the hallway. A floorboard creaked near the bedroom door. I stepped back into the living room. The hallway was empty, but the bedroom light was on. I was certain I had left it off. I checked the room carefully. Closet, bathroom, under the bed. Nothing. No bags, no shoes, no signs someone had been there. But when I opened the fridge again, the yogurt container was gone. The spoon, too. At this point, I started feeling less like a guest and more like someone who had accidentally entered the wrong place. I opened the Airbnb listing to double-check the reservation details. The page loaded slowly. For a moment, I thought the app had glitched. Then I noticed something odd. The availability calendar showed the cabin booked tonight, but not just once. 2 reservations appeared on the same date. One under my name, and one labeled simply guest. No profile photo, no details, just another active booking. I stared at the screen for a long time before a quiet sound came from the other side of the bedroom wall. A drawer sliding open, then closing, slowly, like someone trying not to make noise. I stayed still in the hallway, listening. Another movement, fabric shifting, something placed gently on a wooden surface. Then a voice, barely louder than a whisper, from inside the room I had just checked. "Hello?" The word was cautious, confused, the kind of voice someone uses when they think a stranger has broken into the place they rented. And after a few seconds, the same voice said quietly, "I already booked this cabin." Story 3. The instructions left by the previous guest. 2:03 a.m. Someone knocked on the apartment door. 3 slow taps, evenly spaced, and then the handle turned slightly, like whoever was outside expected it to be unlocked. I was standing in the kitchen at the time, pouring water into a glass. The apartment listing had said check-in was contactless. No host visits, no staff. Just a keypad and a one-night stay in a small downtown building. So when the handle moved again, gently testing the lock, I set the glass down and stayed very still. Because I hadn't told anyone I was there, and the host didn't know what time I arrived. I had checked in around 11:40 p.m. The building was one of those older city apartments with narrow hallways and heavy wooden doors, the kind where sound carries in strange ways. 4 units on the floor, 2 lights in the hallway, no front desk, no cameras in the lobby, just a lockbox near the entrance with my key inside. Everything about the place felt ordinary when I walked in. Small kitchen, a couch near the window, bedroom through a short hallway. Nothing unusual. Until I noticed the note. It was sitting on the kitchen counter, folded once, plain white paper. No envelope. At first I assumed it was something the host had left. Maybe instructions for the Wi-Fi or garbage disposal. But when I opened it, the handwriting looked rushed, uneven, like someone had written it quickly before leaving. The note said, "If you're staying here tonight, read this carefully." Under that were 3 lines. "Don't open the hallway door after 2 a.m. Ignore footsteps outside the apartment. If someone knocks and says they are the host, don't respond." That was it. No name, no explanation. Just those instructions. I stood there for a while trying to decide whether it was a joke. Maybe a previous guest messing with whoever stayed next. People do things like that in rentals. Leave fake ghost notes, hide plastic spiders. The handwriting looked real, though, and the paper felt new, like it had been written that day. Still, I left the note on the counter and went about my evening. I made tea, answered a few emails. Around midnight, I checked the Airbnb listing again out of curiosity. The host profile looked normal. Photo, reviews, response rate, 100%. Nothing about strange rules after midnight. Around 1:20 a.m., I started hearing footsteps in the hallway outside the apartment. Not loud, just the soft sound of someone walking slowly past the door. The building floors were old wood, so every step carried through the frame of the apartment. At first I assumed it was another tenant, but after about 15 minutes, I noticed something strange. The footsteps never reached the stairwell. They would start near the far end of the hallway, walk slowly toward my door, stop, and then turn around. Every few minutes, back and forth. At 1:47 a.m., I checked the peephole. The hallway outside looked empty. The overhead light buzzed quietly. No one standing there. But a few seconds after I stepped away from the door, the footsteps started again. Slow, measured, stopping directly outside my apartment, then walking away. By 1:59 a.m., the pattern was impossible to ignore. Every pass ended at my door. Every pause lasted about 10 seconds. Then the footsteps moved again. I looked over at the note on the counter. The first line stood out in the dim kitchen light. "Don't open the hallway door after 2 a.m. At exactly 2 a.m., the footsteps stopped. The hallway went completely silent. 3 minutes later, the knocking started. 2:03 a.m. 3 slow taps. Not loud, just enough to echo through the wood. Then a quiet voice from the other side of the door. "Hey." The voice sounded calm. Male, maybe middle-aged. "I'm the host." The door handle moved gently. "I just need to come in for a second." I didn't answer. The note sat on the counter behind me, its edges curling slightly in the kitchen humidity. Outside the door, the man tried the handle again. It rattled once against the lock. Then the voice spoke again. "You must have seen the note." A pause. "That was from the last guest." I felt a chill move through the apartment, though the heater was still running. The man outside continued speaking in the same calm tone. She thought it was funny to scare people. Another pause. You can ignore that. The handle turned slowly again, still locked. I stepped back toward the kitchen and opened the Airbnb app on my phone. The host chat thread was still there, but the profile picture was gone. Where the name had been earlier, the page now said only host account inactive. I refreshed the listing. The property photos were still visible, but the host information section was empty. No name, no reviews, no contact option. At the door, the man knocked again. 3 taps, exactly the same as before. "You don't need to be nervous," he said through the wood. "I just forgot to check something inside." The hallway floor creaked softly as he shifted his weight. Then, after a moment, he added quietly, "I always come by around this time." I didn't move, didn't answer. For nearly a minute, there was no sound from the hallway. Then I heard something else. Not footsteps, a key sliding slowly into the lock from the outside. Metal touching metal, turning halfway, stopping. The man outside spoke again, almost conversational now. "You know," he said, "the last guest left in a hurry." The key turned slightly, then stopped again. She didn't realize I had another key. I looked back toward the kitchen counter. The note was still there, but something about it suddenly felt different, because beneath the 3 instructions, in smaller handwriting I hadn't noticed earlier, there was one more line. Written so lightly it blended into the paper. It said, "He has a key that isn't listed in the app." At the door, the lock clicked softly, and the handle began to turn.